All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're talking about a story that isn't really about digging in the dirt. It's about a revolution in ideas, a huge clash of thought that totally changed the game for the entire field of archaeology.
And really, it all comes down to this one very tricky question. Archaeologists, they dig up things, pots, bones, buildings, not thoughts. So how in the world can we ever know what people believed, what their symbols meant, or how they actually saw their world? For decades, this question basically split the entire discipline right down the middle.
So on one side of the ring, you had processual archaeology. Think of this as the science of survival camp. It was all about adaptation, systems, and how people dealt with their environment. But then a new challenger stepped up, post-processual archaeology, and their whole argument was, wait a minute, we can't just ignore the meaning behind all this stuff. The symbols, the ideas, the culture, that's the heart of the human story.
Okay, so to really get this clash, here's how we're going to walk through it. First, we'll look at the old guard, the reign of that scientific approach. Then, we'll see how a symbolic revolution came along and challenged everything. After that, we are diving straight into the messy argumentative fallout. And to wrap it all up, we'll ask the big question: where does this leave archaeology today?
So let's wind the clock back a bit. Before the 1980s, the big idea in archaeology, the dominant force, was a movement that everyone called New Archaeology, or processionalism.
And the mission here was pretty clear. Make archaeology a hard science, just like physics or biology. The focus was on these big picture systems. How did entire societies adapt to their environment? Culture itself was just seen as a practical tool for survival. They called it an extrasomatic tool, which is a fancy way of saying a tool that exists outside the body. And all that other stuff, like beliefs and symbolism, well, that was all considered epiphenomenal. Basically, it was just a side effect, a minor byproduct of the real stuff that drives history: finding food and not dying.
But by the early 80s, a whole new generation of archaeologists was starting to get pretty frustrated. They felt like this super scientific approach was just missing something really important: the actual human element. And in 1982, all of that frustration just boiled over.
And this is the book that lit the match. It's called Symbolic and Structural Archaeology, and it was edited by a guy named Ian Hodder. This thing wasn't just another boring academic book, it was a signal. As one scholar put it, it was the coming of age of a coherent cohort of young, energetic scholars with a strongly defined new agenda. It immediately became a lightning rod for debate.
This quote right here gets to the heart of the most radical idea in the whole book. Hodder and his crew argued that material culture, pots, tools, even people's garbage, it's not just a passive reflection of what people did. No, it's an active player in society. It's meaningfully constituted, which basically means our stuff shapes us just as much as we shape our stuff.
So what on earth does active material culture actually mean in practice? Well, let's look at some of the wild examples from the book. Instead of just seeing pottery styles as a way to date a site, they saw them as tools for creating social status and showing you're different from another group. Or get this, the way people threw out their trash wasn't random. It could be a deliberate social strategy, maybe part of a power negotiation between men and women. And burial practices? They weren't just about honoring the dead. They could be used as a powerful tool to hide or even deny that social inequality existed, making a society look way more equal than it really was. All of a sudden, every single object had the potential to be part of a huge social conversation.
Now, the publication of this book didn't exactly lead to a polite academic discussion over tea. Oh no, it kicked off what everyone started calling the theory wars. The early conferences where these new ideas were being debated were described as very confrontational and unpleasant, with visiting scholars literally trading harsh words. Things got ugly. And the book's legacy was, well, really divided, as you can see here. On the one hand, the positive impact was huge. It opened up these incredible new ways to do research. Archaeologists finally started focusing on things like gender, identity, and the body, and it sparked the rise of public archaeology. But the negative consequences were just as real. The whole discipline kind of shattered into these competing subfields, and the new movement faced this really serious accusation: relativism. The idea that if meaning is all that matters, then anything goes. Any interpretation is just as good as another. Let's look at that positive side for a second. One of the original contributors to the book, Mark P. Leone, argues that maybe its greatest impact was in making archaeology relevant to the public. The logic became, hey, if our work plays a role in modern society, then we should own that role. Don't just hide the archaeology away in a museum basement. Get out there and educate with it. And today, that idea is pretty much a cornerstone of the field. But, and this is the fascinating part, the very same scholar, in the very same essay, points to the deep anxiety this whole revolution created. He argues that by abandoning a strict scientific method, they opened the door to that relativism problem, where the truthfulness of any position could be challenged. For him, the deep split that defined archaeology for an entire generation, it started right there, with that book. So after a generation of all this debate, all this fighting, where does that leave the field? Did the revolution succeed? Or did it just leave behind a bunch of fractured, warring tribes of archaeologists?
I think this quote from a 25th anniversary review of the book just says it all. What was once a radical, fringe challenge to the old way of doing things has, over time, become totally mainstream. The ideas that were once seen as just unthinkable, that material culture is active, that ideology actually matters, that's now just part of how archaeology is done. It means a modern archaeologist might analyze pottery not just for its age, but for what its design tells us about social identity. The unthinkable became normal science.
This timeline really shows you the classic arc of an intellectual shift. It kicks off in 1968 with the establishment of the scientific New Archaeology. Then, boom, the spark of revolution hits in 1982, followed by years of intense, pretty nasty debate. But look where we end up. By 2007, a generation later, the dust has more or less settled. Those once radical ideas have been absorbed into the mainstream. It's like the full life cycle of a revolution in thought, laid out right here.
So what's next?
Well, this is Ian Hodder, the guy who edited the original book, looking back 25 years later. He frames the whole debate in these classic philosophical terms. You had the thesis of scientific archaeology, and it was met with the antithesis of symbolic archaeology. His hope now is that after all the fighting, the field might finally be ready for a synthesis, an approach that takes the best ideas from both sides. And that really leaves us with the big question for today. After all that conflict, the theory wars, the fragmentation, is the discipline finally moving past those old divides? Is it possible that the future of archaeology isn't about choosing between science and meaning, but about finding a way to bring them both together to tell a much richer, more complete story of our human past?